Lady Elara Sterling decided to ruin her life precisely at 10 o'clock in the evening, under the suffocating weight of 1,000 glittering crystals in her aunt's ballroom. It was not a grand, dramatic decision, but a quiet, settling thing, like dust gathering on a forgotten heirloom. She stood near a potted palm, a fixture as unremarkable as the wilting flowers pinned to her gown, and watched the vibrant swirl of society. She was 27, a spinster by every definition that mattered, and her value had depreciated with each passing season until she was little more than a family debt given human form. Her fingers tightened around the delicate stem of her untouched champagne flute. The liquid inside had long since gone warm, its bubbles surrendering to the oppressive heat of the room. A chill, however, traced a path down her spine, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the temperature. Earlier, she had overheard her aunt speaking to Lord Ashworth, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that carried with the brutal clarity of a death sentence. The words had been about Mr. Finch, a man whose wealth was as vast as his manners were crude, and whose clammy hands seemed to linger just a moment too long on any lady he addressed. He was to be her husband. The arrangement would save the Sterling name from the precipice of financial ruin. It was a transaction, a simple exchange of goods. Her life for their comfort, her future for their standing. Elara felt a hollowness scoop out her insides, leaving behind a fragile shell. Resignation had been her companion for years, but this felt different. This was an erasure. The quiet life she had imagined, one filled with her books and her botanical sketches, was a fantasy dissolving like mist in the morning sun. The music swelled, a jaunty waltz that felt like a mockery of the frantic hammering in her chest. She watched the couples twirl, their laughter dying like candles running out of air before it could reach her secluded corner. She was invisible here, a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. That was her role, to be present but unseen, a silent testament to her family's dwindling fortunes. Powerlessness was a garment she had worn for so long it felt like a second skin, tailored to her form, constricting her breath. It was then that the ballroom seemed to hold its collective breath. The music did not stop, but the hum of conversation faltered, a wave receding from the shore. The doors at the far end of the room had opened, and a man stood framed in the archway. He was not merely tall, he was imposing, a figure carved from shadow and granite. The cut of his coat was severe, the black fabric absorbing the light around him. His face was a study in cold geometry, all sharp angles and unyielding lines. Alistair Vance, the Duke of Blackwood, her distant cousin. A man spoken of in hushed, fearful tones. They said he was ruthless in business, cold in his dealings, and utterly devoid of warmth. His family history was a tapestry of tragedy and scandal, and he had emerged from its ashes to rebuild the Blackwood name with a terrifying, single-minded focus. He was a creature of winter in the midst of a summer ball, and his presence sent a shiver through the room that had nothing to do with a draught. Elara watched as he moved, his progress parting the sea of society like a ship's prow through water. His eyes, the colour of a stormy sky, scanned the room with an unnerving intensity, dismissing face after glittering face. They were searching. Her heart gave a peculiar, painful lurch when those eyes, so devoid of emotion, finally landed on her. They did not waver. They did not move on. They held her pinned to her spot beside the wilting palm. He began to walk towards her. It was not a stroll, but a deliberate, inexorable advance. The crowd seemed to melt away from his path, leaving a clear line between the master of the world and its most insignificant inhabitant. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the blood drain from her face. He had never spoken to her, never acknowledged her existence in the handful of times they had been in the same city, let alone the same room. He stopped before her, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. The scent of winter air and old books clung to him. He was even more formidable up close, the lines of his face deeper, the coldness in his eyes more profound. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Lady Alara," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of stones grinding together deep underground. It held no warmth, no courtesy, only fact. She managed a small curtsy, her knees feeling as brittle as glass. "Your Grace," she whispered, the words barely audible. She expected him to move on, to have mistaken her for someone else, someone important. He did not. He continued to study her, his gaze so intense it felt as though he were peeling back the layers of her polite facade to see the quiet desperation beneath. "I have a proposition for you," he stated, the words clipped and devoid of any preamble. It was not a request for a conversation, it was a declaration. Alara could only stare, her mind a blank slate. "I require a wife," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, though it lost none of its carrying power. "A duchess to manage my household and present a respectable front to society. The position comes with a title, a home, and complete financial security." He paused, his eyes flicking for a moment to her aunt, who was watching them with a mixture of avarice and terror. "I am aware of your family's financial difficulties. I will settle all of them, in their entirety." The words fell like stones into a frozen pond. Alara felt the air leave her lungs in a silent rush. This was madness. A duke, this duke, proposing marriage to her here, in this manner? It was not a proposal. It was a business negotiation. She was being offered a position, not a partnership. "Why me?" she finally managed to ask, her voice a thread of sound. His expression remained unreadable, a mask of cold indifference. "You are suitable," he said, and the word landed like a slap. "You are of good breeding, quiet, and I am told you are intelligent. You will not cause scandals. You will be an appropriate Duchess of Blackwood. That is all I require." Suitable, appropriate. The words were as cold and hard as he was. He was not offering her an escape. He was offering her a different, more gilded cage. She thought of Mr. Finch, of his damp hands and leering smile. She thought of a life spent as a commodity, her value calculated and her purpose defined by others. Then she looked at the Duke. His cage was vast and empty, but it was a fortress. And inside it, she would be safe from the likes of Mr. Finch, with a library. "I accept," she said, with a library. "I accept," she said, the words tasting of ash and surrender. A flicker of something, surprise, satisfaction, crossed his features for a barest second before it was gone, replaced by the same stoic mask. "Excellent," he said, as if they had just concluded a deal for a shipment of grain. "My solicitor will call on your father in the morning. We will be married by special license at the end of the week." He offered her his arm. It was not a gesture of gallantry, but of ownership. When she placed her trembling hand on the black wool of his sleeve, she felt the unyielding muscle beneath. It felt like steel. It felt like the bars of her new prison. The journey to Blackwood Manor was conducted in near total silence. Alara sat opposite her new husband in his perfectly sprung carriage. The rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves, the only consistent sound between them. The wedding had been a swift, sterile affair in a cold London chapel, attended only by a pair of solicitors as witnesses. Her family had been ecstatic, their relief so profound it was almost obscene. They had sold her, and they had gotten a magnificent price. The Duke, her husband, had not spoken more than a dozen words to her since she had accepted his bizarre proposition. He read from a leather-bound book for most of the journey, his face a study in concentration, as if she were not there at all. Ilara watched the lush green countryside slide past the window, the scenery a stark contrast to the bleak landscape of her own thoughts. She was the Duchess of Blackwood now. The title felt alien, a costume she was wearing that did not fit. Blackwood Manor rose from the landscape like a jagged piece of the earth itself. It was a Gothic masterpiece of grey stone, all soaring towers and sharp angles, softened only by the dark green ivy that clung to its walls. It was magnificent and utterly without welcome. It looked like him. As the carriage rolled to a halt, a line of servants appeared on the steps, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions carefully neutral. Alistair stepped out of the carriage and turned to help her down. His hand was cool and firm around hers, his touch impersonal, a necessary courtesy. "This is your home now," he said, his voice flat. He led her inside, into a great hall so vast and shadowed that the light from the high, arched windows seemed to get lost before it could touch the floor. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of beeswax and old stone. Their life together began as it had started, in silence. They were two ghosts haunting the same grand mausoleum. Dinners were formal, excruciating affairs in a dining room that could have seated 50. They sat at opposite ends of a long, polished table, the distance between them a vast, unbridgeable chasm. The clinking of cutlery was the only conversation. He would read his papers, and she would push food around her plate, her appetite a casualty of the oppressive quiet. He was a creature of routine and discipline. His days were spent in his study, a room she was not invited to enter. His nights were spent in his own wing of the manor. They were husband and wife in name only, two strangers bound by a contract. Ilara found herself adrift in the cavernous house. She explored its endless corridors, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She found a library that took her breath away, 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, filled with treasures she could have only dreamed of. It was there she sought refuge. One afternoon, while searching for a particular volume on horticulture, she left her sketchbook on a reading table. It was filled with her private passion, detailed, intricate drawings of plants and flowers, each petal and leaf rendered with scientific precision. She forgot about it until the next morning, and when she rushed back to the library, her heart pounding with the fear of having her private world exposed, it was gone. Panic seized her. Had a servant cleared it away? Had he found it? The thought of his cold, critical eyes on her work made her feel ill. She spent the day in a state of quiet anxiety. That evening at dinner, the silence felt heavier than usual. He said nothing, his expression as unreadable as ever. 2 days later, she was wandering the West Wing, a part of the house that seemed largely unused, when she found a door that had previously been locked. Hesitantly, she opened it. The room inside was flooded with northern light from a magnificent, newly installed wall of glass. In the center of the room stood an artist's easel and a large drawing table. On the table, arranged with meticulous care, were brand new sets of drawing pencils, fine brushes, and pots of expensive ink and watercolor. And next to them, placed squarely in the center, was her sketchbook. Ilara's breath hitched. She walked into the room, her fingers tracing the smooth, polished surface of the new table. He had done this. The cold, unfeeling Duke had seen her work, and instead of dismissing it, he had given her a sanctuary. He had built her a studio. He had not said a word, had not made a grand gesture. He had simply seen a need and fulfilled it. A quiet act of what? Not kindness, surely. It was too impersonal for that. It was an investment, perhaps. An investment in the contentment of his Duchess. Whatever it was the first crack in the marble facade. Other small things began to happen. She mentioned once to the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, that she found the library chilly. The very next day, a fire was laid and lit in the grand fireplace every morning, and a soft cashmere blanket was left folded on her favorite reading chair. She never saw him give the order, but she knew it came from him. One day, exploring the overgrown grounds, she discovered the skeletal remains of a forgotten rose garden, choked with weeds and thorns. It was a sad, neglected place, but she could see the ghost of its former beauty. She spent hours there, sketching the twisted, ancient rose bushes, imagining what they might look like in full bloom. A week later, she looked out her window to see two gardeners beginning the painstaking work of clearing the weeds and pruning the old wood. Alistair was there, standing at the edge of the garden, directing them with quiet, concise instructions. He looked up, and his eyes met hers across the distance. He gave a curt nod, the same one he had given her at the ball, and turned back to his work. These silent gestures were unsettling. They did not fit the man she thought she had married. The ruthless, unfeeling Duke was a man of action, not words, and his actions were beginning to paint a very different picture. He was observant, attentive even, but the wall between them remained. He was still a stranger, a powerful, enigmatic presence at the edge of her life. She was his Duchess, a suitable and appropriate fixture in his home. And yet, she was beginning to feel that perhaps, just perhaps, he saw more than that. He saw her. The London season demanded their presence. Ilara dreaded it. Returning to the city meant returning to the whispers, the curious stares, the society that had so eagerly cast her aside. Blackwood Manor, for all its coldness, had become a sanctuary. London was a cage of a different sort, one with 1,000 watching eyes. Alistair informed her of their impending trip with his usual economy of words. "We will open the London house for a month. There is a ball we must attend." It was a command, not a request. Ilara simply nodded, her stomach twisting into a familiar knot of anxiety. The ball was exactly as she had feared. The moment they entered, a hush fell over the room, followed by a wave of murmurs. She was the surprised Duchess, the spinster who had somehow snared the country's most powerful and coldest prize. She could feel their eyes on her, dissecting her gown, her jewels, her very presence at the Duke's side. She kept her head high, her expression serene, a mask she had perfected over years of social invisibility. Alistair was a formidable shield. His presence alone kept most of the curious at bay. He was polite, remote, and utterly unapproachable. He procured her a glass of lemonade and left her seated in a quiet alcove while he went to speak with a government minister. It was then that the true threat emerged. Lady Beatrice Crawford approached, her silk gown the colour of poison green, her smile just as venomous. She had been considered the front-runner for the position of Duchess of Blackwood before Alistair's shocking marriage. Her fury had been the talk of the town for weeks. "Well, well," Lady Beatrice began, her voice carrying to the surrounding guests. "The little brown mouse herself. I must confess, we were all so surprised. One wonders what sort of dreary magic you used to ensnare the Duke." Ilara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice even. "I am sure I have no idea what you mean, Lady Beatrice." "Oh, I think you do," she sneered, leaning closer. "A penniless spinster from a ruined family. He must have been truly desperate. Tell me, does he even speak to you? Or did he simply purchase you like a piece of livestock to breed an heir?" The insult was so public, so cruel, that the air around them crackled with it. Ilara's carefully constructed composure began to crumble. The words struck at the very heart of her insecurities, because they were so close to the truth she believed about herself. She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. "That is quite enough." The voice was not loud, but it cut through the chatter like a shard of ice. Alistair was suddenly there, standing behind Ilara's chair. He had moved so silently she had not even heard him approach. His face was devoid of all expression, which was somehow more terrifying than any show of anger. His eyes, fixed on Lady Beatrice, were flat and cold as a winter lake. "You do. Allow me to make one thing perfectly clear, not only to you, but to anyone else who might be listening." He looked around, his gaze sweeping over the gawking guests, who immediately tried to pretend they had not been eavesdropping. "Lady Ilara is the Duchess of Blackwood. She is my wife. An insult to her is an insult to me. Should I hear of any such disrespect again, you will find that my memory is long and my influence is vast. Do you understand?" The threat was unspoken but brutally clear. Lady Beatrice paled, her face a mask of fury and humiliation. She mumbled a hasty apology and practically fled. A profound silence fell over their corner of the ballroom. Alistair turned to Ilara. His expression was still unreadable, but she thought she saw a flicker of something in the depths of his eyes. "Concern? Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He had defended her. Not just defended her, he had publicly claimed her in a way he never had before. "My wife." The words echoed in her mind. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of ownership, but it had sounded like more. It had sounded protective. He extended his hand. "We are leaving," he stated. She placed her hand in his, and he led her from the ballroom, his back ramrod straight, a silent, intimidating monarch leading his consort from the battlefield. The carriage ride back to their London house was thick with an unspoken tension. The silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was charged, filled with the echoes of his words and the startling power of his actions. He had protected her. The cold, distant Duke had drawn a line in the sand and placed her firmly on his side of it. And Ilara, for the first time, wondered if the fortress he had built around himself had a door, and if, somehow, she was being invited to find it. Back within the quiet walls of the London townhouse, the tension from the ballroom followed them. It settled in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Alistair dismissed the servants for the night with a curt wave of his hand. They stood in the grand foyer, the gaslights casting long, dancing shadows that made the space feel even larger and more empty. Ilara finally found her voice. She had to understand. She turned to face him, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to still their trembling. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the marble mantelpiece, his back partially to her. She insulted you. It was unacceptable. She insulted the Duchess of Blackwood, Alara corrected softly. She insulted your name, your choice. This is a contract, Your Grace, a business arrangement. My personal honor was not included in the terms. He turned slowly, and the look on his face stopped her breath. The mask was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded expression of such profound weariness and pain that she felt it like a physical blow. The unreadable Duke was suddenly, shockingly transparent. "Do you truly believe that is all this is to me?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion she could not name. "That I would purchase a wife as I would a horse? That I would bind a life to my own out of mere convenience?" Alara was speechless. That was exactly what she had believed. It was what he had led her to believe. He took a step towards her, then another. He seemed to be fighting a battle with himself, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. "There is something you must know," he said, his voice strained. "Something I should have told you from the beginning. But I am not a man skilled in these matters. Words fail me." He gestured towards a set of doors she had never seen him use. "Please, come to my study." His study was the heart of his world, and it was the heart of the man himself. It was a room of dark wood, worn leather, and the scent of old paper and fireplace smoke. Books were not just on the shelves, they were stacked on tables, on the floor, on every available surface. Maps were pinned to one wall, charts of investments and shipping lanes. It was a room of order, intellect, and profound solitude. He did not invite her to sit. He walked over to a heavy oak desk and unlocked a small, unassuming drawer with a key he wore on a chain around his neck. He hesitated for a moment, his shoulders tense, before withdrawing a small, flat object. He held it in his hand for a long moment before turning and holding it out to her. It was a miniature portrait, painted on a delicate sliver of ivory, no bigger than the palm of her hand. Alara took it, her fingers brushing his. A jolt, like static electricity, passed between them. She looked down at the portrait. Her own face looked back at her. But it was a younger version of herself, perhaps from 10 years ago. She was not in a ballroom or a formal setting. She was sitting in a meadow, her head tilted in concentration, a piece of charcoal in her hand and a sketchbook in her lap. She was drawing a wildflower. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, and there was a smudge of charcoal on her cheek. She looked completely absorbed, at peace, and entirely unaware of being watched. Annual fete on the Marquis of Abernathy's estate. You were seated under the old oak tree by the river. You were there for hours, sketching a patch of cowslip. The memory surfaced, hazy and distant. She remembered that day. She had been 17 and had slipped away from the crowds and the noise to be by herself, to draw. "You were there," she breathed, not as a question, but as a realization. "I was there," he confirmed. "I had just inherited the dukedom. My father had left things in a ruinous state. Not just the finances, but the name, the honor. There was a terrible scandal. He was a cruel man, and my mother, she was not strong." He looked away towards the dying embers in the hearth. "I was 22, and the weight of the world was on my shoulders. I felt as though I were drowning in darkness." He fell silent, and Alara waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. "And then I saw you," he continued, his voice barely audible. "You were so engrossed in what you were doing, so serene. You were like the first glimmer of light after a long, terrible night. In that moment, watching you, I felt a flicker of something I thought I had lost forever. Hope. He finally met her eyes again, and the raw vulnerability in them was staggering. I loved you, he whispered, and the words, so simple, so direct, shattered the world she thought she knew. I have loved you since that day, for 10 years. But you never spoke to me, she stammered, her mind struggling to reconcile the cold, distant Duke with the man standing before her, laying his soul bare. You never gave any sign. A bitter, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. And what would I have offered you? A broken title? A mountain of debt? A man who had been raised in a house with no love, who knew nothing of tenderness or warmth? I was a ruin. Elara, I was not fit to be your husband. You deserved sunshine and laughter, not the shadows of Blackwood Manor. He began to pace the room, the confession pouring out of him now like a river breaking through a dam. So I made a vow. I would rebuild my family's fortune. I would restore its name. I would make myself worthy of you. It was the only thing that drove me. It was my singular focus for a decade. I watched you from afar. I learned of your love for botany, for books. I followed every season, hoping you would find a good man, someone who could give you the life you deserved. He stopped and faced her, his expression agonized. But you did not. And then I heard the rumors about your family's troubles. I heard them speaking of Mr. Finch. His name was a curse on Alistair's lips. The thought of you, of your light, being given to a man like that, I could not bear it. It was a failure on my part. I had waited too long. I had been a coward. The coldness, the distance, the transactional proposal, it all clicked into place. It had not been arrogance or indifference. It had been desperation. The desperate, clumsy act of a man who loved her so much he thought himself unworthy. A man who did not know how to ask, only how to provide. He had sought to save her the only way he knew how, by offering a contract, a fortress, a name. He was protecting her from Finch, but also protecting her from what he believed was the darkness within himself. Tears welled in Elara's eyes, blurring the image of the man before her. The lonely, silent dinners, the studio, the fire in the library, the restored rose garden. They were not just gestures. They were love letters, written in a language she had not understood until now. He had been trying to give her the world, piece by quiet piece. She looked from the miniature in her hand to the man standing before her, his powerful shoulders slumped, his face etched with a decade of loneliness and longing. He was not a block of marble. He was a man who had shielded his heart so fiercely that he had almost suffocated it. You were wrong, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. He looked at her, his expression filled with confusion and a sliver of renewed pain. Wrong? You thought you were a ruin, she explained, taking a step towards him. You thought you had nothing to offer. But you were wrong. All those years, I felt invisible. A piece of furniture to be moved around, a problem to be solved. I was so lonely. I thought my heart would turn to dust. She was standing directly in front of him now, close enough to see the silver flecks in his stormy grey eyes. She reached out and gently touched his cheek. He flinched at the contact, as if unused to a gentle touch, but did not pull away. His skin was warm. In your silent house, she continued, her voice trembling, In your quiet, unspoken acts, I felt seen for the first time in my life. You saw me, Alistair. Not the spinster, not the family burden. You saw me. A single tear escaped his tightly controlled composure and traced a path down his cheek. He covered her hand with his own, his grip tight, desperate. Elara, he breathed her name, and it was a prayer, a confession, a plea. The great, impenetrable Duke of Blackwood was undone. He was just a man, flawed and vulnerable, who had loved her from afar for a decade, too afraid to reach for the very light that gave him hope. Her own heart ached with the weight of all those lost years, all that silent suffering. But it also swelled with a feeling so powerful, so profound, it left no room for regret. She rose on her toes and gently pressed her lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion, but of acceptance, of understanding, of homecoming. For a moment, he was utterly still, frozen in shock. Then, with a shuddering breath, he responded. His arms came around her, pulling her close, holding her as if he were afraid she might dissolve into mist. His kiss was tentative at first, then deepened, a release of a decade of pent-up reverence, loneliness, and a love so patient it had nearly broken him. In the heart of the silent, shadowed London house, under the watchful eyes of 1,000 books, the contract was broken. And in its place, something real, something fragile, and something beautiful began to grow. 2 years later, sunlight streamed through the newly cleaned windows of Blackwood Manor, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The house was no longer silent. The sound of a child's laughter echoed down the long corridors, a sound so joyous it seemed to have chased the last of the shadows from the corners. Elara stood in the center of the restored rose garden. It was her masterpiece, a riot of color and fragrance. Old gnarled bushes grew alongside new vibrant breeds, their blossoms a tapestry of deep crimsons, soft pinks, and creamy whites. She held a small chubby hand in hers, guiding her 1-year-old son Arthur as he took wobbly, uncertain steps on the soft grass. Alistair came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. He was a changed man. The harsh lines of his face had softened, the permanent tension in his shoulders had eased. He smiled now, a real, warm smile that reached his eyes, transforming his entire countenance. He was no longer a creature of winter. Elara had brought the spring. "He has your determination," Alistair murmured in her ear, his voice warm as he watched their son stumble, fall, and push himself back up with a resolute gurgle. "And your stubbornness," she countered, leaning back against his solid warmth. "He has been trying to eat the soil from that pot of dinde de coeur all morning." Alistair chuckled, a low, pleasant sound that still made her heart flutter. "He has excellent taste, then. It is your finest specimen." They stood there for a long while, a family bathed in the afternoon sun, a quiet portrait of domestic peace. The vast, cold manor had become a home, filled with light and laughter and the scent of roses. The servants, who had once moved with fearful efficiency, now smiled openly. The great dining table was rarely used. They preferred to take their meals in a smaller, sunnier breakfast room, their chairs close together. Later that evening, after Arthur was asleep, they sat together in the library. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. Elara was sketching in her book, a new design for a section of the gardens, and Alistair was reading aloud from a book of poetry. His voice, once so clipped and formal, was now rich with expression, rising and falling with the cadence of the verse. She paused in her drawing, watching him. She thought of the man at the ball, the intimidating duke who had offered her a contract. And she looked at the man before her now, her husband, his face softened in the firelight, his heart completely and utterly hers. He had spent 10 years building a fortune to be worthy of her, but he had not understood. His worth was never in his title or his gold. It was in his quiet attention, his fierce loyalty, and the patient, unwavering love he had hidden for so long. He looked up, sensing her gaze on him. He stopped reading and simply looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, abiding love that still, after 2 years, took her breath away. "What is it?" he asked softly. "Nothing," she said, a gentle smile touching her lips. "Everything." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. It was a simple, familiar gesture, but it spoke of a universe of shared trust and affection. He had thought himself a ruin, unfit for her, and she had thought herself invisible, a life already over. They had both been so terribly wrong. Together, they had rebuilt each other, turning a cold, empty fortress into a sanctuary. True freedom, she had learned, was not about escaping a cage, but about finding the one person in the world who saw you, truly saw you, and chose to build a home with you, right there in the light.